So welcome everyone again. Having survived a new year, transitioning into the year 2014, and having this week survived something that they call the polar vortex. Many of us Wisconsinites, remember years ago, we just called it a cold snap, right? We just called it a cold snap. Yeah, just bundle up, huh? Put on, long underwear and make sure you wear your galoshes, and that's what you use. So, we're starting with a new year, an introduction to a new study of the Epistle of St. James. We had a little bit of an introduction last week. I just want to pick up again and talk about it. Just review a little bit in order to get this down. On your outline, we give outlines. Roman numeral, the second section on authorship. We have to explore that. And section 3 this morning on just a kind of a survey of the epistle itself before we go into breaking it down. I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly because we did look at it last week. In the New Testament, there's at least 4 people by the name of James. So which James wrote the Epistle of James? There's one James we can dismiss very quickly. He's only mentioned once. It is said that he was the father of Judas. Shortened to Jude, not Iscariot. Not Judas Iscariot, okay? And he's only mentioned once, and we know scant, nothing else about him. Secondly, and probably the most famous James, brother of John, son of Zebedee. One of the 3 closest companions to Jesus. Some of us were raised to call him James the Greater, one of Jesus' most intimate companions. Peter, James, and John, they always seem to be at the most significant events in Jesus' ministry. It is believed that his martyrdom, his death, is accounted in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 12, verse 2, put to death by King Herod Antipas around the year 42. He hardly could be the author of this, since he's put to death so early. If we look in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 12, verse 2, we can see what it says about him, this James. So we have him anchored in the scriptural tradition. So Acts of the Apostles, chapter 12, verse 2. Yeah, this actually it talks more than just verse 2, but starting from verse 1. About that time King Herod laid hands upon some members of the church to harm them. He had James, the brother of John, killed by the sword. And when he saw that this was pleasing to the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter. And then it goes on about Peter's arrest, along with John, and it ends up with Peter's miraculous jailbreak, if you will, from that arrest. There's a footnote here in the New American Bible. It says this Herod, this is King Herod Agrippa. He ruled Judea between 41 and 44. It says, while Luke does not designate a motive for this execution of James and his intended execution of Peter, the broad background lies in Herod's support of Pharisaic Judaism. Jewish Christians had lost the popularity they had in Jerusalem, perhaps because of suspicions against them traceable to the teachings of Stephen, the deacon, the first martyr. So, the next James that we find is James, the son of Alphaeus. He was one of the 12, sometimes called James the Less or James the Younger, not in the Bible, but in tradition, in the scriptures. He's mentioned in Matthew chapter 10, verse 3, Mark 3:18, Luke 6:50. Some attempts have been made to identify him with James, the brother of the Lord, but this is difficult to reconcile with other biblical passages. It is understood that his mother was named Mary, and she was, besides Jesus' mother at the foot of the cross, they said the other Mary in the Gospel of John. And that other Mary was the mother of this James, the wife of Alphaeus. He is believed to have been clubbed to death upon sentencing by the Jewish Sanhedrin around the year 62. Around the year 62. It's extremely unlikely that he was the writer of this epistle. He is closely identified also with St. Philip, the apostle of Bethsaida. May 3rd, they have their joint feast. The fourth, James, is called by commentators he's identified as James, the brother of the Lord. Listed in the listings of those who are identified as brothers of the Lord, we look at Mark chapter 6. You look at Mark chapter 6. Jesus returned to his hometown, Nazareth, after he had begun his public ministry. And so it begins, verse 1 of chapter 6 of Mark. He, meaning Jesus, departed from there and came to his native place, accompanied by his disciples. And when the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue. And many who heard him were astonished. They said, where did this man get all this? What kind of wisdom has been given him? What mighty deeds are wrought by his hands? Is he not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James, Joses, and Judas, and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. Now, the brother of the Lord. In Protestant circles, they have no problem identifying this James and these other men as being children of Joseph and Mary. the mother of Jesus because they don't hold to the perpetual virginity of Jesus like the Roman Catholic Church does. The Orthodox Christianity has a tradition going back into the earliest centuries, identifying these as children of Joseph by another woman, probably before he took Mary as his wife. There is a further listing with some different names in Matthew chapter 13, verse 44. But wherever these brothers of the Lord are mentioned in the Gospels, James is always first. James is always first, which would seem to indicate he was the older, he was the more important, the more prominent. Okay? Now, the biblical scholar in the 4th century, St. Jerome, cites him, James, as the brother of the Lord, as the reputed author of this epistle. Now, we have to reconcile this. We studied the epistle of Jude, right? Between 1st and 2nd Peter, we studied the little epistle of Jude, and in the introduction to that epistle, Jude is identified as the brother of James. Jude, the brother of James. Now, that would seem to fit in this listing of the so-called brothers or relatives of the Lord. Relatives of the Lord as Roman Catholic tradition understands them. Not one of the 12. Not one of the 12. As a matter of fact, there's other passages that indicate in the Gospels that these so-called brothers of the Lord kind of hung back. They did not right away become disciples or followers of Jesus. They kind of hung back. And yet it's kind of understood that they may have been present in the Acts of the Apostles at Pentecost with the coming of the Holy Spirit. There was 120 after all. That number is given in the Acts of the Apostles for that birthday of the church. So we don't know for sure. Now, in apocryphal works, New Testament apocryphal works, Gospel of Hebrews, it says, the risen Jesus appeared to this James, after which he came to prominence in the early Jerusalem church. The Gospel of Thomas, in the Coptic version, Jesus tells his disciples, go to James the Just. Go to James the Just. So this is another moniker for this James. The Just. But from apocryphal sources. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, in his book The Antiquities, Josephus reports that this James was executed by stoning under the high priest Ananias in the year 62. It sounds very close to James, the son of James, the brother, the third James that we had up there. Western tradition, however, has identified this James as son of Alphaeus in the past. However, that view now has been abandoned. Let us focus also, in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 15. You look at the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 15. Let's take a look at that. there's a prominent James. How many James do we have here? 1, 2, 3. How many guys named James? 4. No. Here in this room. 1, 2, 3, 4. We have at least 4 here.
How many Jacobs do you have?
No Jacobs, but I know where our friend Jim here. Wouldn't it have been easier, folks, if they would have given them nicknames like, Jimmy or J.A. or J.R.? And he was that consistent? It was either son of Zebedee or son of Alphaeus, and okay, who's your mama? Maybe that'll help. They should ask, who's your mama? Okay, so in Acts chapter 15, we get what is called the Council of Jerusalem. Peter, Paul, and Barnabas coming before the gathering of the leaders of the church in Jerusalem to deal with the issue of the baptism of Gentiles. And after they gave their presentations and so on, Acts chapter 15 verse 13 says, after they fell silent, James responded, "My brothers, listen to me. Simeon has described how God first concerned himself with acquiring from among the Gentiles a people for his name." Then he quotes from a prophet. Verse 19, "It is my judgment, therefore, that we ought to stop troubling the Gentiles who turn to God, but tell them by letter to avoid pollution from idols, unlawful marriage, meat of strangled animals, and blood. For Moses, for generations now, has had those who proclaim him in every town, as he has been read in the synagogues on every Sabbath." And then the apostles and the presbyters, in agreement with the whole church, decided to choose representatives and send them to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas, along with a letter, verse 23, telling them of this decision. And it is pretty clear here that this James of Jerusalem, speaking up as he did, his identification with an understanding of Mosaic law, his identification with the understanding of the Judaic religious tradition, and the implication of how to apply it in a situation that had become a crisis point for the early church. And his position seems to have carried the day, which essentially gave Paul then and Barnabas the green light to begin their huge missionary activity amongst the Greek-speaking Jews and expand Christianity eventually across Asia Minor and into Greece and so on, and the drawing into the circles of Christians. Now, of Christianity or early church, those who were not Jews. This is the position, beginning this, basically not necessarily the separation, but the demarcation between Orthodox Judaism and this subsect that became known as the followers of the way, and then became known as Christians later on. subsect of Judaism. Now, the time period for this historical moment in the history of the church is around 49 or 50 AD. So this James then is identified not only as brother or Jew, but James of Jerusalem. We're looking at this passage in Acts chapter 15. In order to establish the significance of this personage. Was he synonymous with the brother of the Lord? Was he synonymous? Was he the same person? Was he the same person as the brother of the Lord? The first of those listing of the brothers of the Lord. It doesn't identify him in Acts in that way. Okay? Tradition has kind of placed him at that. Then we get verification from Paul in Paul's letters that after Paul goes on his first and second missionary journey, Paul comes back to Jerusalem and tells them what he has been up to, and particularly in St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 2, he mentions several times that he visits Jerusalem, and he makes a point that he goes and talks to James first. And then later on, he talks to James and Paul, he talks to Peter and James, who he identifies as the pillars of the church in his letter to the Galatians, Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 2, verse 9 and verse 12. Thomas?
Well, chapter 7 of John's Gospel, verse 5 says, "For even his brothers did not believe in him."
Yeah, and that's one of the gospel passages that indicate this listing, of which James is the head of the list. Those are the people that we believe in John's gospel that he's talking about. Okay? He didn't believe in them right away. So, all of a sudden, it doesn't become very clear, does it?
No pictures.
No pictures. Yeah, if they would attach pictures to it right away. Now, we still go back to the question, which James, and which James wrote this epistle? And, most scholars are side either on one side or the other. Certainly, this James we can cross off the list. He was a father. This James, because of what we looked at, his death coming around about 42, that would be before that meeting or council of Jerusalem that we looked at in Acts. So he would be out of the question. Okay. James, the son of Alphaeus. Okay, but we know very little else other than this James. His mama was at the foot of the cross. This James, in the listing that we just looked at, possibly brother of Jude, was he the one who said and took this very courageous and decisive step at the Council of Jerusalem which opened it up to everyone, and who supposedly then wrote a letter or had a letter written that went to the Acts of the went up to Antioch, the church in Antioch. Today, most scholars, it seems, side with this personage. However, we're not done yet. There's another point, not a person, a point. On the outline, we have the position that this letter, the letter's author is synonymous. Synonymous. Okay, so we've seen this when we looked at 1st and 2nd Peter. We've seen this when we looked at Jude. We've seen this some of the Paul's letters as well. First of all, in the Greco-Roman tradition in the 1st and 2nd century, there was a long-standing tradition of letters, treatises, writings, if you will, in the Greco-Roman philosophical tradition of people writing in the name of a master many years after the death of the master, when they were confronted with new issues or new problems of the day. The recipients of those letters would have understood in this tradition, would have understood that the name that is attached was already dead, but that the position being taken here by the disciples or students or the next generation of those who had been steeped in this philosophy, who had been taught by the master, their position is responding to a new issue, a new problem, a new situation, and it's what would so-and-so, the master, have said. And that's what this letter is presenting. But it's presented, and the name of the master is attached to it. I was trying to think, how can we compare it today? And I think the best way to compare it today would be, writing papers, maybe in high school. Certainly if you went to college and had to write papers, you were taught the methodology. Cite your sources, right? Mm-hmm. And a certain methodology in how to cite your sources, right? To prove what position or point you were taking. Cite the source that you're getting it from. It's kind of akin to that, all right? That the teachings of a former master is applied to a more contemporary problem, even long after the master is dead. And that writing then is passed down, but the name attached to that writing isn't the pupil who wrote it, but it is the master's name attached to it, like citing your source. Yes?
Years and years ago, a lot of female authors would use a male name because they didn't want it to be female author pushed aside. If they used a male name, it would be read.
Okay, so years ago, female authors used the male name, otherwise their writing would not have credibility, wouldn't be accepted in circles. Yes?
You were looking at my introduction to James, and it says here something to the effect that consequently many scholars today place the composition of the letter of James at the end of the 1st century or the beginning of the 2nd. The archaic character of the Christology will then not due to the antiquity of its composition, but to the fact that it issues from Judeo-Christian ethics. In other words, what they're saying is basically the pseudonym that you're talking about, because it says next in the next paragraph that this, if however the authenticity, I can't even read, of the letter is maintained, its composition must be placed before 662 when it's quote the James died.
Yeah, there are some scholars that really hold that it was James the brother, and this James is said to have died around 62. This James, 62 or 64. Okay. But you know the situations that letter seems to be responding to seems to come in a post James, in the second half of this second century of Christianity. So much later than this. Those who hold to a synonymous writing then place the writing of this letter somewhere between 80 and 100 AD. They have no problem with that. There are some characteristics that I want to get into. One of the modern Catholic sources that is very popular as a biblical scholar today. He was a former evangelical minister, and then converted and became Catholic, and now he teaches at Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio. Scott Hahn is his name, Dr. Scott Hahn. A couple of years ago, for Christmas, this group gave me his Catholic Scripture dictionary, a Catholic dictionary of the Scriptures. It was a great big thick thing like that. He says on this authorship business that the author was obviously a Jewish Christian who wrote with authority. That's it. Okay. There are some points that those who take the position that this is a synonymous writing, I want to quickly go through those points. Number one, this is written in excellent Greek vocabulary and style. Probably is some of the best that we can find in the New Testament. The probability of a first century Jew raised in Galilee would not have the facility, the background, obviously, in classical Hellenistic culture, writing ability, schooled in Greek, a Jew from northern Galilee, which would have been the brothers of the Lord, or any of these, James. So that's one point. Now, the lack of universal acceptance or canonicity before the 3rd century, or even later into the 4th and 5th century. This letter was not accepted right away into the canon. I mentioned last week that the earliest canon that we have is called the Muratorian canon from the early 3rd century, and James is not listed in there. It's not listed until later, and it's only begrudgingly that even like St. Jerome used it and put it in his writings in the Vulgate Bible. So lack of universal canonicity, but other scholars say, well, that's easy to understand given this historical. In 66, the Jewish wars against the Romans broke out. Okay? It started in northern Galilee and went down into, and the Roman soldiers surrounded Jerusalem and besieged the city of Jerusalem for almost a year. 70 AD, they broke through, they slaughtered many of the inhabitants and so on of Jerusalem. Question is, what happened to the apostolic, Palestinian, Jerusalem Christian community? What happened to that first community?
Dispersed.
Okay. To where?
Syria, other Middle East countries.
Well, there's evidence in some of the early writings of the apostolic fathers, particularly. They went to a place in Jordan called Pella. A place in Jordan called Pella, and that they went out of the city of Jerusalem way before, so that they would not be embroiled in this fight as well. If that be the case, then either James, the son of Zebedee, brother of John, or James, son of Alphaeus, or any of these three James, if they skedaddled and got out of there before, well, not these two, because there's strong indications of when they died. So James, this brother of the Lord, that he wrote this maybe from that sanctuary when Jerusalem was being destroyed by the Romans, this place called Pella in Jordan, so that this letter was circulated, not widely circulated like Paul's letters up and down the postal trade routes of the north end of the Mediterranean Roman world, but only amongst the Hebrew / Gentile Christians out of Jerusalem, the early Jerusalem church. Huh?
Then why would it be in such good?
Then the question is, then why was it written in Greek style? Here's the thing. Even the Greek philosophical tradition that I said was written by other hands. They had secretaries. They had people who were trained as copyists, as scribes, who knew how to take, first century shorthand, if you will, or whatever they used, okay, and then amplified it, after that. So it's not inconceivable. As a matter of fact, it's very probable that he used a secretary. Even Paul, in some of Paul's letters, he indicates that he has someone writing this for him.
And the old prophets. Yeah, but would you have for your secretary someone from fishing village?
Would you have as a secretary someone from your fishing village? No. But if you were someone who came out of, Nazareth was not a fishing village. Okay. James, sons of Zebedee, yeah, but not James, brother of the Lord. If Nazareth was his home, they would have used someone else so that it would be widely read. The main language across the Mediterranean world at that time, was probably Greek, the common denominator, okay? Latin amongst the Latins and Romans. That.
You want to put this in modern day understanding, synonymous authorship. Think of the sports sponsorships. They always pick on a famous athlete, somebody that's well respected in the sport to endorse the product. So maybe people in that time picked on people that were well respected just for endorsement because of their position in the society.
Okay.
Not necessarily because they wrote it.
Well, Tom's indicating, like today, sports, picking a sports sponsor and so on. More along the lines, though, Tom, of this, some of these great athletes, all of a sudden, even while they're still in their careers, a book comes out. Okay? Why someone would write a book of your memoirs when you still have an active athletic career makes no sense to me. Okay? So it's like, do like the 1962 and 64 Green Bay Packers. Wait till your career is over first, and they're ready to put you in some Hall of Fame, and then have a sports writer write a book and put your name to it, okay? But we see that all the time today, right? People have books, sports athletes, and so on. Okay, so there's that. There's also a strong indication that this was written after James and even after Paul. A point that was brought up in the introduction that Roy read to us out of the New Jerusalem Bible. Excellent introduction, by the way. Any of you have a New Jerusalem Bible? Take a look, at that introduction. Okay. Page 1991. It starts. But it indicates something about the theology that's missing here, and the absence of specific Christian theology about Jesus as the Christ of faith. Last week I spent some time indicating in the Middle Ages Martin Luther's strong objection to what was written in this work. And Martin Luther, to a certain extent, is correct that there isn't much of the theology of salvation or the Christology, the Christ of faith, that emerges from understanding his passion, death, and resurrection, and therefore his glorification. I want to talk some more about that later. And the fourth point I want to make, the absence of any kind of strict legalism or ritualism that traditions about James the Just would expect. That's absent here. So, most scholars today, James, this letter was written by a Christian well versed in both Hellenism and Judaism, well schooled in Greek writing style, vocabulary. We would say punctuation and grammar, but okay. And named after this James of Jerusalem after his death. Although, even on that position, there's a split decision. A lot of this stuff, folks, you have to die to find out. All right. So, all right, Thomas.
In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 7, says, when Jesus rose from the dead, it says, 1 Corinthians 15:7, after that he was seen by James, and then by all the apostles, and Paul says, last of all by me. So evidently none of the apostles were dead then when Christ rose from the dead. And none like commentaries or footnotes tell who wrote James.
Right.
It's obvious.
Right.
Nobody knows that.
Yeah. Well, and what I'm trying to give you is, what most of the scholarly commentators are giving to us today. Because which James are we talking about? Well, we don't. Most of them lean to James, this brother of the Lord. Also, James of Jerusalem from Acts chapter 15, and known in later New Testament Apocrypha as James the Just. Now the second thing I want to look at, the next section, the survey, look at the language and style just a little bit because I touched on it already. Language is written in excellent Greek. Some say it ranks some of the best in the New Testament. Obviously written by a trained exegete. So, where's my outline? The next thing on your outline, you probably have exhortation, right? Huh?
Yes.
Okay. So, what kind of writing is this? Now we're talking about a literary style, excellent biblical oratory style. Now, there's a term that's used in for this kind of writing as found in the scriptures in biblical scholarship terms. It's called paranesis. I use this term when we're looking at 1 Peter and 2 Peter as well. This indicates that it's a moral exhortation. It's concerned with how people are living out their faith, concerned with ethical conduct. Now, paranesis as an exhortation style, and particularly here in James, it emphasizes two things. In James, we find a series of moral maxims, kind of like Proverbs, moral maxims, okay? Just throws it out without a whole lot of other. But the kind of verification of those moral maxims used in James, he uses models or examples from the Old Testament scriptures that should be imitated. So models as sources for certain behavior. The other interesting thing that scholars point out, there's like 108 verses in this letter of James. They, looking at these various moral statements and so on, at least 46 of them seem to be an amplification of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount or Sermon on the Plain, as we find Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5 through 7, or Sermon on the Plain, as found in the Gospel of Luke. If you take a look and match up and compare this epistle of James, 46 of those verses seems to have taken something, an allusion at least, to something in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and amplified it to be applied to the Christians of this next generation. Very, very interesting. And that's why they call this along the lines of paranesis, a moral exhortation. Also, there's at least 3 spots in here where he quotes from the Old Testament. So he's familiar with Old Testament citations from the book of Leviticus, particularly love your neighbor as yourself. That he pulls that out, but maybe he got that from the same source that Matthew and Luke use, because that's found also in the Sermon on the Mount. Book of Genesis, he refers to Abraham, and Proverbs. So, also there are allusions to elements found in the book of Wisdom, of the Old Testament. And the Old Testament apocryphal work, Ecclesiasticus, or in many Catholic modern Catholic translations, it's called the Book of Sirach, or the Book of Ecclesiasticus. Also, they've done some comparison. You know, in all the Dead Sea Scrolls they found from Qumran, the community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's one significant one. It's called the Manual of Discipline. And they read that and compared it to James, and they found some very strong parallels there, connections, allusions to that as well. The bottom line is this. With exception to these Gospels, Matthew and Luke, there's no other New Testament writing, so one commentator says, that rings and echoes Jesus' sayings, particularly on the Sermon on the Mount, as much as James. Besides the Gospels, there's no other New Testament writing that echoes what Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount more than James. So James represents a type of early Christianity that emphasizes sound teaching, sound moral behavior that is responsible, and he encourages the following of practical models of virtue consistent with those found in the in the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, and he uses examples of Abraham, Rahab, Job, and Elijah. Yes?
In the writing of James, he doesn't refer specifically to those individuals, nor does he document his writings in those theological bases. So as you said once before, this is not so much a theological writing as it is you standing up there and doing a homily.
It's more. Some have called this more of a sermon than an epistle or writing. But I have some things to say about the theology, because I indicated last week that Martin Luther called this an epistle of straw because he disagreed doctrinally with the emphasis in this on works over faith. But Martin Luther's strong identification of sola fide, we're justified by faith alone, has a strong groundwork in a certain kind of Christology that he does not find that Christology here. And he has some pointed things to say, positions to say about that from a theological standpoint. Now, Martin Luther was a doctorate degree theologian of the 16th century, professor at Wittenberg University and so on. But Christology isn't the only ology, Christian theology that developed out of the first centuries. All right? We've seen in 1 Peter, Jude, 2 Peter, a very strong eschatology, teaching about the end time with the parousia. Some of that is present here. What we also find is a development of what is called ecclesiology, development of church. Certainly Paul has in his letters the encouragement and direction of some of those Christian communities that he was writing to that indicates his understanding ecclesiology. But what James does is maybe give us another ecclesiology, which may be older than that which is found in Paul's writing. Come next week, I got more to say about the theology. Thank you very much, everyone.
Well, I will go
See if it's like watching.